Alrighty, this looks like a good time to get started. Let's continue talking about graphing, and this time we're going to talk about horizontal transformations. So here, when we're talking about horizontal transformations, of course, we're talking about moving things left and right. So with that, our primary thing is we're going to be adding or subtracting from our x values. So for our horizontal, we're going to be adding or subtracting to the x values. Now, this one's going to be a little bit different because instead of adding to our y, we're going to be taking something and adding a value to our x. And I'm going to put this in as minus h, and you're going to see why in just a second. Because what happens, and this one's a little bit tricky, if I am subtracting something from my x, then I'm going to be moving things further to the right. So if I've got f of x minus h, this is going to move my graph right h places. If I've got f of x plus h, this is going to move the graph left h places. And you might wonder why this would be opposite. You'd think if it's minus, it would move more towards the negative. Well, let's show you why that is. So we're going to go through some examples again. And here I'm going to once again stick with our function of our absolute value. So I'm going to say my original function here is f of x is the absolute value of x. So if I were to do something like have my x and my f of x, it'd be really easy to see that I could do something like have like negative 2 is going to be, would be, absolute value of negative 2 is going to be 2. The absolute value of negative 1 is going to be 1. Absolute value of 0 is 0, and so on. Would be 2. Well, let's see what would happen if instead I had like a g of x where inside this essential transformation, remember before I was adding something outside of that absolute value? Well, here I'm going to do this inside it. I'm going to say we've got x, and just to start with, I will subtract a 5, and we're going to see what's going to happen with something like this. So when I figure out what my g of x is going to do, let's think of what happens if I were to put into place, if I were to do this and say, oh, well, g of negative 2, this is the absolute value of negative 2 minus 5. All of a sudden, this value is getting bigger. This is going to be a absolute value of negative 7, which is a positive 7. This actually moved this up. Well, let's see what happens when I continue this trend. If I were to say, well, let's take a look at what happens when I do g of negative 1. Well, that's going to be negative 1 minus 5. That's absolute value of negative 6, which is just 6. 6. Oh my gosh. Absolute value of 0. 0 minus 5 is going to be negative 5. The absolute value of negative 5 would be 5. 4, 3. And what happens is this entire thing has gotten shifted to the right 5 places. Let's show you what this looks like on a graph. So once again, our absolute value, we've got our x and we've got our y. Our absolute value is where we've got, oh, I'm taking the absolute value of whatever my x is, so like -3 would be 3, -2 would be 2. So we've got a graph that does something like this, up until a point it hits 0, and then it starts acting like a line with a positive slope. So here is my, this right here is my absolute value of x. Here's my f of x, equal to the absolute value of x. And as we said, with this shifts this entire thing to the right 5 places. So at -5, so if I plugged in that -2 before, -2 minus 5 was -7. So that was, or -7, and then absolute value is +7. So that's up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's right there at 5, 6, 7. And what happens when we take a look at this is all of our values get shifted. Now, we'd think that maybe it might move up or down, but still, I don't have anything outside of this absolute value. So I know that all of my values have got to end up being positive. And notice that all I've done is shifted this entire thing to the right 5 places. And there's that g of x equal to our absolute value of x minus 5. Now, this seems a little counterintuitive, but think about this like critical value here at 0. At 0, absolute value of 0 is 0. But what would I have to have, what would this have to be in order for my value inside this, like I say, our essential relationship, in this case, our absolute value? It would have to be 5 in order for this absolute value to be 0 again. So we're basically not looking at, or when we say this is minus and that shifts us right, we're looking at the difference between these two. And that is the reason why things are going to move right with the subtraction. Okay. And, pretty similarly, if I wanted to, I could take anything. I could say, well, let's take an m of x. And say, well, let's do an absolute value of like x plus 4. Here, if I were to put in anything smaller, if I were to plug in like a 0, this would be absolute value of 4, so 1, 2, 3, 4. If I were to plug in a 1, it would be a absolute value of 5. Huh. That looks a little bit like, if I were to plug in like a -4, that would be a 0. -4 plus 4 would be 0. So, right there. -5 plus 4 would be absolute value of -1, which would be a 1. And we'd see that this same pattern holds up. All we're doing is taking this same shape and we're shifting it either to the left or to the right. Here this was plus 4, which moves that to the left 4 places. Alrighty. I think that's enough for right now, so I will see you in the next video.